much evidence suggests that speakers tend to repeat previously encountered structures. So if you have heard or repeated passive forms, you're more likely to use passive forms in future. And many studies have used the structure primings to examine the representations that underlie a structure choice. And earlier finding from these studies led to the idea that structure priming is driven by the persistence of abstract syntactic representation that is independent of message level information. However, sentences differ not only in syntax, but also in other aspects. And specifically, evidence has been building that the message level information can also be primed. And some findings even suggest that structure priming may not occur based on abstract syntax alone. So in the current study, we examine the extent to which syntactic priming is independent from the priming of conceptual order. And we did this focusing on structural priming during a noun phrase production because this allowed us to tease apart the two priming effects. Cleland and Pickering demonstrated structural priming in noun phrase production, and they used a dialogue task where participants took turns with the confederate in describing pictures. And they found that participants are more likely to use relatively close targets such as squares as red after a relatively close prime, such as diamond that's green, rather than after adjective noun primes. And it was also found that when prime and target had the same noun, like square that's green and square that's red, as participants are more likely to repeat their partner's structure, showing a larger priming effect. But whether prime and target had the same adjective didn't have a clear impact on structure priming. And these results were explained in relation to the residual activation model. So in this model, syntactic structures are represented as combinatorial nodes in association with syntactic heads, so noun in this case. So when we hear the prime description such as square that's green, it activates the noun's lemma square and the combinatorial nodes that specify a syntactic structure and the link between them. The assumption is that structure priming occurs because combinatorial nodes remains active, and this increases the chance for this node to be selected again. Also, syntactic priming can be boosted by noun repetition because the link between the noun lemma and this combinatorial nodes also remains active, and this further biases structure choice. Now, in this model, adjectives are not associated with the combinatorial node. Therefore, adjective repetition is unlikely to enhance structure priming. Now, as you know, this model is primarily concerned with syntactic representation. This is a model of syntactic priming. But descriptions such as square that's green or green square differ not only in syntax, but also in conceptual order. For example, the position of the adjective is different. And recent findings suggest that conceptual order within noun phrase can also be primed. So if you hear somebody say green spotted lock, you're more likely to describe this lock as blue striped lock rather than striped blue lock. So the question is how conceptual order priming might interact with syntactic priming. And experiment one contrasted two possibilities. The first possibility is that syntactic priming occurs independently from conceptual order priming, and these two effects do not interact. The second possibility is that they do interact, such that syntactic priming is stronger when prime conceptual order is also perseveres. And we use a web-based referential communication task. So participants, who are all native speakers of British English, listened to a prime description and selected the object that was described. So they had a prime description such as green spotted bow, and they have to mouse click the referent of the description. And then they have to describe the target object, which was marked by the box, so that the referent could be uniquely identifiable. Now, in this very first experiment, we manipulated two variables. The first variable was prime conceptual order. So the prime had either a color pattern order or a pattern color order. And we also varied the syntactic structure of the prime. So prime had either adjective, noun structure, let's call it AAN structure, or adjective, noun, relative clause structure, let's call it RC structure. The question was whether these prime manipulation have an effect on how people describe this target object. So if prime conceptual order has an effect on conceptual order choice, that is choice between color pattern or pattern color order, then there should be more pattern color orders after pattern color prime rather than after color pattern primes. But if syntactic prime syntax has an effect on syntactic choice, that is choice between AAN or RC structures, then there should be more RC responses after RC primes than after AAN prime. But an interesting question is whether these effects interact such that the effect of syntactic priming is stronger when conceptual order is also primed. In this first experiment, noun prime and target always had the same noun, and this was to maximize the chance to get a priming effect. We had 48 participants and 36 items. And this is the result. So we classified participants' responses into 4 categories. So this blue color represents cases where participants produce color pattern orders. And this pinkish color represents cases where participants produce pattern color orders. And darker color represents relative clause responses. And brighter color represents adjective, noun sequences. And here on the x-axis, we have 4 prime conditions. And as you could probably notice, each target response occurred most frequently in the condition where prime and target had the same syntax and same conceptual order. For example, CPAN occurred most often when prime had a CPAN structure, and CPRC response occurred most often when prime had a CPRC structure, and so on. So this suggests that participants repeated the combination of conceptual order and syntax. And this also means that overall, participants produce more relative clause structures after relative clause prime compared to after adjective, noun primes, showing an effective syntactic priming. Also, overall, participants produce more pattern color orders after pattern color primes than after color pattern prime, showing an effective conceptual order priming. But importantly, how these effects might have been related. So to check this, we examined whether the effect of prime syntax was stronger when prime and target had the same conceptual order than not, by creating a new variable which coded whether prime and target had the same or different conceptual orders. And then we examined whether this new variable interacted with the effect of prime syntax on syntactic choice. And as you can see from the graph, it did. So the effect of prime syntax, that is the difference between AN and RC condition, was larger in the same conceptual order case, in the cases where participants produced same conceptual order as a prime than when they had a different conceptual order. Conceptual order cases, but effective prime syntax was significant for both for same conceptual order and for different conceptual order. We also checked whether the effective prime conceptual order was stronger when prime and target had the same syntax or not, by creating a variable which coded whether prime and target had the same syntax or different syntax, and we checked whether this new variable interacted with prime conceptual order on ordering choice. And it did. So the effect of prime conceptual order was larger for the same syntax than for different syntax, but a simple effect was nevertheless significant for both same syntax and for different syntax. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in this very first experiment, prime and target always had the same noun. And so we did another experiment to see whether the pattern of results might differ when prime and target always had different nouns. And it did not. So we found the effect of prime syntax, and also effect of prime conceptual order on conceptual choice. And the effect of syntactic priming was larger for the same conceptual order than for different conceptual order, though the simple effect was nevertheless significant. And likewise, the effect of conceptual order priming was larger for the same syntax than for different syntax. But again, the effects of conceptual order were reliable in both cases. So these findings suggest that neither the priming effects nor the interaction between them require a repetition of specific lexical items or concepts. In experiment 1, we saw that syntactic priming and conceptual order priming do interact, but we also saw that a degree of independent priming, in a sense that syntactic priming occurs even when conceptual order is not primed. So to understand the mechanism of these effects, experiments 2 and 3 examined how the conceptual order and syntax might be represented. And we did this focusing on the impact of noun and color or pattern repetition on conceptual order priming and syntactic priming. And we contrasted two possibilities. The first possibility is that conceptual order and syntax are integrated at the syntactic level. That is, syntactic information is conceptually specified. All these possible responses are represented separately, such that spotted belt as green primes PCRC node directly. So under this model, syntactic priming and conceptual order priming should be boosted in the same way. An alternative possibility, however, is that conceptual orders and syntactic information are represented at different levels. So spotted belt as green primes PC node pattern color nodes at conceptual level and RC node at the syntactic level. But the link is also primed, and this allows interactive priming. Under this architecture, syntactic priming and conceptual priming could be boosted differently, right? And especially syntactic priming may be boosted by noun repetition only, whereas conceptual order priming could be boosted by color or pattern repetition, as well as by noun repetition, because syntactic categories may not be represented at the conceptual level. In experiment 2, we focused on conceptual order priming, presenting only adjective noun structures as prime, and we manipulated noun and color and pattern repetition in separate experiments. So experiment 2A, we manipulated prime conceptual order and noun repetition. So we had noun repeated prime and noun non-repeated prime, and we presented either color pattern primes or pattern color primes. In experiment 2B, we manipulated color repetition instead of noun repetition, so we had color repeated primes. And conceptual order was manipulated in the same way. And finally, experiment 2C, we manipulated pattern repetition, so we had pattern repeated prime. And each experiment had 48 participants and 36 items. And this is a result from all 3 experiments. So remember, this experiment, we only manipulated prime conceptual order, but not the syntax, right? So we plotted a percentage of color pattern responses and pattern color responses, yeah. And on x-axis, we have color pattern prime and pattern color prime as conditions. And on the left, we have repeated condition, and on the right, we have non-repeated conditions. Now, all experiments found the main effect of prime conceptual order. So participants produced more pattern color orders after pattern color primes than after color pattern primes. Also, in all experiments, the effect of prime conceptual order was larger in a repeated condition compared to non-repeated conditions. So in experiment 3, we asked whether a syntactic priming can be boosted by color or pattern repetition as well as by noun repetition, because some findings suggest that syntactic priming could be enhanced by any repetition. So we manipulated noun and color pattern repetition as before, but we had an additional variable that was prime syntax. So prime syntax had as prime description had either adjective noun structure or relative clause structures. And we had 40 experimental items and 48 participants took part in each experiment. And this is a result from all 3 experiments. So we plotted percentage of target responses like this. And on the x-axis, we have prime syntax condition, AAN and ASCII condition. And on the top panel, we have color pattern prime. And on the bottom panel, we have pattern color prime. On the left, we have repeated condition. On the right, we have non-repeated condition. Now, the question was whether syntactic priming interacts with noun repetition or color repetition or pattern repetition. So we analyzed the syntactic choice by including prime syntax and prime conceptual order and repetition as fixed effects. And all experiments found the main effect of prime syntax, as you can see. So there are more C responses after C primes than A primes. But only noun repetition interacted with prime syntax. So there was a stronger priming effect when noun was repeated than when the noun was not repeated. We also checked whether conceptual order priming could be boosted by noun or color and pattern repetition. All experiments show main effect of conceptual order, prime conceptual order, and prime conceptual order by repetition interactions. The effect of prime conceptual order was larger in a repeated condition than in a non-repeated condition, as we found in experiment 2. So experiments 2 and 3 show that conceptual order priming can be boosted not only by noun repetition, but also by color or pattern repetition. But syntactic priming can only be boosted by noun repetition. Right? So all these results suggest that structural priming has 2 components, conceptual order priming and syntactic priming. And these effects occur at different levels of representation, but interface between the 2 levels facilitates structural priming. So spotted about as green activate pattern color node at conceptual node and relative close combinatorial node at syntactic level, and also the link between them. And this increases the chance of both nodes being selected again. Now we assume that color or pattern repetition enhances conceptual order priming, but not syntactic priming, because adjective lemma is not associated with the syntactic nodes. So although repetition of green enhances conceptual order priming by a link between green and BC node at conceptual level, it doesn't bias structured syntactic choice, because the lemma green is not associated with this relative close node or AN node. Finally, some researchers proposed 2-stage model of grammatical encoding. The speaker first assigns grammatical functions before ordering them linearly, whereas other researchers have argued against such a model, proposing 1-stage model of grammatical encoding. Clearly, our proposal differs from either account. The current study points to the presence of abstract conceptual order, which interact with grammatical encoding. And our argument is that the combination of the abstract conceptual order and the syntactic information enables the construction of both functionally and linearly specified syntactic representations. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Kumiko.
Yeah.
There's already